So hey everyone, I'm Matt. I guess yeah, I did a bunch of experimentation before coming to Growth Book and sort of getting moving to the revenue side of that. Most notably at OkCupid, a dating site, which was uh, very well used about a decade ago. My most important experiments were successful, so I did get um, married to someone I met on OkCupid while working for OkCupid. That's not today's story, but happy to talk about that sometime. Um, and today we're going to be talking about experimentation more generally, and about Growth Book, which, as many of you know, is an A/B testing and feature flagging system. So what we're going to be going over today, we're going to kind of cover a few different things. First, we're going to try and just guess the outcome of some A/B tests to warm up a bit and also really drive home the point that it's very hard to know in advance what the result is going to be just by trying to look at something and use logic. Then we'll kind of get to the meat of this talk around the feature graveyard and how the best companies are throwing out more than half of what they build and expose to customers, which seems extremely strange to most people. So we'll go into why that's the case and what you should probably do about it. Then we'll do a quick overview of how Growth Book works for new users. I know a lot of people here, I recognize some names in the chat, are experienced. This is not going to drag on very long. It's more of just a sneak preview for folks that haven't happened to use the platform before, but don't worry if you're experienced. We'll get through all that in about 5 minutes or so. And then we're going to have a experimentation themed game of guessing and skill where we'll give away some Growth Book swag. I've got one of our beautiful shirts for here right now. Lots of Zoom has decided it's part of the background. There we go. We have lots of terrible experimentation themed puns, as well as some less conspicuous logos if you're not going for that. And then finally, depending on what people are looking for, what questions you ask, I do some Q&A, or I can throw up some advanced A/B testing topics to go through. So that's what we'll be spending our time doing today. We'll start with a few guesses here. So we're going to look at a few A/B tests, and I'd encourage you to take a position on which one won here. Kathy, maybe we'll drop that survey because we're going to be revealing progressively, unfortunately. But if you wanted to put in the chat like just A or B, it's less about we need to read this and parse the results, and more that you will learn more from this presentation if you make yourself take a position. And the greater the extent to which you're willing to put yourself out there and guess, the greater the extent to which the point will impact that guessing is hard. So our first one, the control, we're showing a price with kind of a cross out and what you saved, with a variant of showing a larger percentage of what the deduction is. As you can imagine, any small percentage change in the amount of stuff Amazon can sell adds up to a pretty big number. So in this case, it looks from the chat like we have almost even split of what people are favoring, with slight bias towards A. In this case, variant B was actually the winner. And the links at the bottom here to these tests that we're showing that are public information are available if you're curious afterwards. Now we'll go over to Airbnb. So let's say we're trying to entice you to list your place, to do some rentals, and you either have this kind of higher level control of what you can gain from a philosophical perspective, or if you can select how many people, where you're located, and see how much money you're going to get. So we'll get to Airbnb later, but they throw out more than almost anyone else, which means they're very good. I'm seeing a preponderance of Bs so far, which makes sense to me. I would go with B. I actually started a company with a website that looked a lot like B, and B lost. I was totally wrong about what I would guess here. So I was a bit surprised on this one. Netflix, when they're not crashing due to questionable fights between boxing legends and obnoxious YouTubers, they do have some TV shows. Um, so we've got kind of do we convert better if you just try it now, or if you put in an email address in terms of getting people to actually make an account? We are having a very strong bias towards A here so far, and turns out it's B. So for those that are guessing wrong, that's good. You're putting yourself out there and you're realizing like logic doesn't really work here. You can't put yourself in 100,000 people's shoes. We're going to wrap up with one more. Back to Airbnb. Cancellation is confusing. If you're like me, you've had at least one time where, someone got sick or something came up and it was a little unclear. Can we actually get our money back here or not? So when we trying to get people to book, do we give the details or not? Pretty even split here on what people are guessing. And it turns out that giving the details was not helpful. So the point we're trying to make with all this is not, people should feel good or bad about their guessing acumen, but if you do enough of these, you'll find that you're going to regress towards the average pretty hard. And this exercise can be super useful if there are people at your company not as bought into experimentation as you are, and you want them to start believing that, hey, maybe we should actually listen to the users instead of like let the highly paid people prognosticate upon what is best. So good. You go to this Good UI site. This has a bunch of these experiments. It can be a good way to convince some leadership that, we are unable to guess what is good and need to measure it. So now we're going to really talk about, like what is actually going to be successful here. And I guess maybe to see if people will type things in one more time. And I'd encourage you to think of this before you don't anchor on someone else's response. But how frequently, if you run a test, knowing no other information, are you going to move the metric that you want to move? All right. Good range of guesses here. We are not that optimistic, so we're probably speaking to Andrew. I like the confidence. On a long enough time scale, you should just capture the GDP of the entire world by running, a near infinite number of tests. So the kind of awkward truth is that 2/3 of the time, you probably shouldn't do what you're doing. Because 1/3 of the time you're going to record a loss generally. And if there's no change, that means you've added complexity, you've added tech debt, you've taken that value, not the value of novelty and directing user attention, and you're channeling it into something that doesn't matter. And so by and large, these aren't very helpful changes. And they will, it's very hard to change a culture that's used to kind of just building things and patting itself on the back, because not only the story gets grimmer as you get good. Going to our Airbnb example from earlier, only about 8% of what they're launching actually sticks. And that sounds bad, but actually it means they've optimized their site and their experience so strongly that, virtually all of the obvious ideas have already sort of been priced in. So you get 1/3 naively, and then it drops over time. And so these big companies are having these engineering teams that are spending a ton of time on things that they end up throwing out. And it turns out that that's the right option. So, no one launches something they don't think will win, but it's only successful 1/3 of the time, which, is quite unintuitive to a lot of folks. And let's talk about why that's actually hard. And this really gets into the feature graveyard portion of this presentation. Because to talk about why this is hard, I want to talk about promotions actually, and how incentives work on a lot of software teams. So I was a PM and a developer for 6 years prior to trading in all of my technical credibility and moving into sales. And here's how promos felt for me as a senior PM. It felt like the best way to get promoted was to work on product changes where first, as many people as possible worked for me. You know, when looking at someone's impact, the size of their empire is often a strong proxy. Secondly, there's wide visibility in the organization and perception that the effort would have impact. So the extent to which you could sort of jockey for time during all hands meetings or be featured in updates from senior executives, things like that. The optics management was really important. And then finally, after a product change was made, you wanted to be seen as a success by others. So that means as a PM in an environment that wasn't fully data-driven, getting people to care about my team's work impact did a lot more for my career than actually making impact. And cherry picking a few metrics after the project to make it look good was in everyone's interest on the team, even if the impact was minimal. We were essentially like fully, if you look at it from just what does it take to get promoted, facts don't really factor into it. It's entirely a matter of perception if you're not limited by data. So for example, that audience response company I worked at previously, I worked at a company called Poll Everywhere, and we didn't have a strong culture of data at the time. And so we had a bunch of larger customers where instead of having a couple of polls like this, they might have hundreds of polls in dozens of categories. And we didn't have at the time any layers of abstraction. So you couldn't say, here are the polls for the company-wide town hall, here are the polls for the training, the mandatory compliance training, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought our enterprise customers needed that. And so we embarked on it was Poll Everywhere, and we were building folders. So it, of course, became Polders very quickly. And we thought that was going to be a big deal for our enterprise clients and take about a month or two. Instead, we embarked on a 6-month architectural boondoggle that ended up consuming a bunch of resources, and we finally launched it. Didn't see a lot of adoption or usage. But because I was socializing the project well, and because we found a few metrics afterwards that made it seem important to the enterprise, the perception of it was successful. I had positive feedback on my review, but the people on the team really knew that this wasn't actually something that was super valuable. Now, if I had tried to pull what I did at Poll Everywhere when I was at a Microsoft or a Netflix that was more rigorously testing, that project would have been correctly shelved after a few weeks of, testing what it would look like if it worked, even if we haven't built it yet. And that was the correct answer. And so, in my experience talking to hundreds and hundreds of companies that, because I've been doing this for 5 years, that have done experimentation, a lot of them look more like my experience with Poll Everywhere than they look like Netflix. You are measured by the size of what you attempt and how you're perceived. And, the way you get promoted is a bit more of manipulating the truth than it is making an impact. And that's a problem because most of you have at least one competitor that is, they might be small, but they're kind of growing up in this data-driven world. And if their iteration cycles are going through that hard challenge of, hey, we just spent 2 weeks building this, we love it, but we're going to throw it away because it doesn't help our users, those organizations will quickly overtake people that are living in a non-experimentation world in terms of their conversion rates, in terms of their growth, in terms of the impact they make on their customers. So, it's kind of a gloom and doom scenario if you can't move towards experimentation, if you have enough users that someone else in your field will be able to do that. So the real question is, how do you move towards kind of thinking in these bets constantly? And this is a picture of a casino I was at an event with recently. So if we're going to be thinking in bets and rewarding people who are doing the same, here are 3 key strategies that, on average organizations are not using. If you are, please pat yourself on the back. That can be worth thinking about if you want to move more towards that mentality of like, hey, although it feels crazy, most of what we build is tech debt and hurting our metrics. So let's actually build the right stuff. The first thing to focus on is what's called a North Star. So this is an organization-wide agreement on what metrics matter and how to trade them off against each other. So for example, I work a lot with Little Caesars, a international pizza delivery company. And Little Caesars operates on a franchise model. So the individual stores are owned by private business owners that work with Little Caesars, and they get paid per transaction that happens in mobile apps. So it matters more to them that an order takes place than that the order is large. So they care a lot about the number of transactions. They care the significant amount, but not as much about things like the order size. Now, the issue here is that's something where if you have a test where maybe you make the order size way higher, but you make the transactions a little bit lower, without real guidance, mathematical guidance, a line PM or an engineering manager is not going to know how to trade those against each other. They're going to be worried they're going to get in trouble with somebody. And so what happens usually is, in the absence of a mathematical function of your key metrics, you end up having to wait for a meeting, and then a VP weighs in on it and things like that. And before you know it, your iteration cycle has gone from, we get the experiment, we have a mathematical function that tells us if it's good or not, and we either launch or don't launch, to we get the experiment, we prepare a presentation, we wait a week for a meeting, a VP mulls it over for a while, and your iteration cycle goes up by a factor of 3x. So the reason the North Star metrics matter is if you can make a function where you take the top metrics to your business and you weight them against each other and it comes out to one number, that gives individuals the power to make trade-offs without a bunch of meetings and iteration cycles to happen at the team level instead of some big organization-wide change board. And so that's super, super important for moving quickly. And we have data scientists that are sort of happy to share more with you there if you're trying to come up with these North Stars for your own company. The next piece of it is, sorry, I know we have an international audience, and, baseball is objectively a really boring sport if you didn't grow up on it. But do we have any guesses in the chat as to who this gentleman is? Kind of a long shot. Historically famous baseball player. We'll give it 10 seconds or so. Okay, Simon goes Mickey Mantle. Not a bad guess. I think similar era. Ian Watt with the correct guess right off the bat. Ty Cobb. Okay, so Ty Cobb is famous. So for those that are not particularly familiar, I think cricket would probably also be somewhat applicable here. Ty Cobb had a 366 average. In other words, over a third of the time this person came to the plate, he was able to get on the base. Now, this man is the best of all time at doing that. He is the most successful player across a career. And, less than 4 in 10 times was he successful. So to get to a high rate of experimentation and getting input from, not just leaders, but the whole team, you need to be celebrating making the right bets and embracing the fact that more than half the time you won't succeed. And so you got to, instead of measuring, instead of saying, hey, well, these releases are things we know we need to do, and these releases are just fixing a bug, and we're going to make up all kinds of excuses and only really experiment on 4 or 5 things a month, you should be measuring all your releases on business impact, even the ones you don't think are going to matter, and call your shot in advance on what you're going to move. Not just let yourself do what I did at Pull Everywhere and pick the most favorable metrics afterwards. So before you release it, say, I don't think this is going to change anything. It's just a bug fix. Or I think we're going to bump revenue by 1%. And if we don't, we're cutting this. But moving that focus from every time needs to be successful, which in sports like baseball or cricket is totally untrue, and to a view of, hey, we're making a set of bets. And if we can get, a third of the time correct, that's the best we can do. And the people that are doing that should be celebrated. And speaking of celebrating those folks, getting back to promos, you need to promote and review in a way that rewards people who are making the highest possible impact bets, not managing the largest herd of people or doing the largest and most ponderous releases. And this is really tough because switching promo incentives is challenging because some set of the established leaders are not going to adapt very well to a world in which ideas are king instead of everyone has to shut up during the meeting while the fancy VP is talking. And whether subconsciously or often very consciously, will fight against this. So you kind of need to lead a bit of a cultural revolution at your company to get to the point where, the person who's getting the bump to staff engineer isn't necessarily the one who did the most, who like made the company the most money. It's the person who took the 3 or 4 hardest and most important bets that year, even if only 1 or 2 paid off. Switching the polarity of like how you hire and how you promo is arguably the hardest thing that I'm talking about right now. And it's also the most impactful. The companies like Spotify, where anyone can run a test, and if it succeeds, it goes forward, and you kind of are assessed on how many bets you're making, run rings around the companies where we sort of all just have to listen to the VP's preferences, and they're a terrible designer, but you can't do anything about it or you get fired. So not super politically correct, but like, if there's one thing in most companies you could fix to make experimentation work, it's instead of just talking about it and giving you lip service, like promote on it. So those are kind of the 3 areas I'd recommend looking at, like having a metrics North Star, thinking in terms of like a batting average, and celebrating and promoting the people that are really pushing experimentation forward. At this point, I'm going to cut over into a very brief demo of how Growthbook works for new folks. It's not going to be enough to know how to use the platform, because that would take too long, but more just a series of screens on, what the heck are we talking about here? And after that, we'll get into a giveaway with a swag prize, and then open it up for Q&A. So if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to start putting them in the chat, even if they're not appropriate for this moment in time. We'll address those as we get to that later section. Kathy, anything you want to interject here, or should we keep moving?
No, I think we're good. Yeah, let's do the demo. I think some questions are piling up, and we also have the questions that people submitted earlier. So, yeah.
All right, I'm just pausing my share for a moment while I switch windows. Gonna go ahead and you can hear the angry noises from my keyboard there. All right. So, in a nutshell, what Growthbook is going to do, whether you're feature flagging or A/B testing, is walk through, feature flag will be the beginning of this flow, A/B testing is all the way through it. So you'll have some sort of an idea on what you want to test. Then you're going to split your audience into a set of groups that will remain with them over time, expose them to different variations. This might be right away if they're on a web page, and it's like, what web page do you get? This might be a week or 2 from now if you're setting them into variations based on initial login data and sending them a piece of physical mail or phone calling them or otherwise treating them differently. Then you're going to track what's happened and get a report on, at the end of the day, what is the outcome of this whole thing? There are 2 kind of primary places that Growthbook comes into play from a technical perspective here. The first is going to be when you split those folks into groups, that's going to be needing to be a quick, no latency division when they're exposed to something in an app or a website where we need to make the call right away. And then kind of a slower asynchronous process of harvesting the data of, okay, did those folks go on to make accounts? Did they pay us money? Did they refer their friends? Whatever it is you're trying to measure and test. To do those things in Growthbook, I'm just going to briefly cover what the steps of setting up an experiment are. Again, we have really, really good docs around this. This is not meant to be a, you leave this presentation knowing how to do it. It's more, here's a preview, and then, we'll send you the quick start guide or other things if you're curious after this. But to go through very briefly, when you're creating an experiment, first you'll just kind of have a name of what you're trying to measure. So, maybe we'll just say all caps website, and then we'll say all caps titles, more money. And maybe you'll have some other descriptions there. You'll add some tags on where it is in the flow. Then you need to figure out how is it that we're going to kind of split up the users here. So maybe you're at a B2C company and you're targeting based on someone's ID, or maybe you Maybe you're at a B2B company and we need to do this account by account and you're targeting by company. You can build in as many or as few of these as you want, but the point is that we can sort of split on whatever metric you want to split on. You can choose how much traffic is being exposed to the experiment, how many variations you need. And then if you need any sort of mutual exclusion, like you're running, for the folks that were saying they're running a lot of tests, maybe you're running 2 pricing tests at once, you don't want to run into each other. You could say, hey, I need people seeing experiment A to not see experiment B if that's appropriate. Then finally, you choose how to target this. So we've said, hey, we're taking users by ID, we're splitting them into 4 variants. But the thing we actually need to do is we need to say, we only want to expose this to folks where, maybe they're on a mobile device and their app version is semantically greater than or equal to some number, and they have at least they have more than 3 pets or something nonsensical like that. Meaning that you don't have to do the whole user base, but you can set a very specific set of people that you have interest in. There's lots of other fancy stuff you can do with targeting, like targeting off of other experiments, targeting off of groups passed in from tools like Mixpanel, Braze, etc. But that's what you need to say, who are we going after? Then you can either attach that to a feature flag code change, a low code visual editor change for folks in marketing or product where you don't want to wait for an engineering cycle, or if you're using a CMS, a way of redirecting between different URLs. So at this point, we've said we know who we're targeting. We've done that assignment piece, and we're talking about variations. What is the different treatment that we're exposing them to? Once you've picked some of these, at that point, you'll launch it. And now we're going to cut over to an experiment that's been running for a while, since I don't think we want to sit here for 2 weeks gathering data. So here's an example experiment. We have health checks. You don't have to look at this, but we're going to ping you and flash up big angry lights if there's problems with your experiment. So you don't have to find them with your analysts. We'll tell you in advance. And then you'll see a set of results. There is a lot of potential complexity here with the goal that all your data science PhDs can get everything set up so that they know it's rigorous. But from a PM or marketing perspective, the goal is basically being able to say, hey, if it's green, it's good. If it's red, it's bad. And if it's not colored, then we don't quite know. So the goal is to take a lot of complex statistics and make it really easy to read and make a judgment. If you adopt our advice on the North Star metric, your goal metric, you're going to have one big goal metric that's computing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes, and that's going to tell you what to do. So that is the very fast look at an experiment. There's a lot of depth behind all of this, but I don't want to, take the experienced folks on this call right now and drag that out. So if you're new and you're intrigued, definitely contact us afterwards about what to do there. I'll now move on to our quick giveaway. We're going to be giving away a code to our swag store, which I'm a biased fan of. We have all kinds of shirts and hats and things like that. And this one is going to be very interesting. So we're going to try and do kind of an experimentation theme. Usually you have to guess. You have to guess more about, hey, what is the exact number of something? But what we're going to do is we're going to put something on screen that we want you to try and count. And to build our experimentation intuition, it's not that you need to get who gets closest exactly. It's who guesses the range of things that are counted in the picture that includes the answer and is smallest. So if you think everyone else is going to get it wrong, feel free to guess negative infinity to infinity. But if someone has a tighter range that includes the actual answer, they are going to win. So, please put in the chat. We've got your emails from your sign up. Put in the chat your guess. We'll leave this open for about a minute, and whoever is most accurate will win. So again, put a lower bound and an upper bound. Whoever's got the tightest range and the answer is included in there wins the prize. And the thing you will be counting is please, we can't enforce any non-Googling, so we're just going to ask for your honesty here. But how many Waldo cosplayers are in this picture? The largest gathering of cosplayers doing Waldo. Again, you can probably win if you cheat. We're just going to ask that you don't do so. And We'll time this for about a minute so you have time to guess. I will warn you at the 15-second mark, and then I will type in the chat to sort of close the guessing.
Are we having people type in chat or actually just, oh, there we go, or send you?
Type in chat.
Okay, excellent.
Again, if you're not giving a range, you are not eligible. So for those that have guessed the number, try to put a fence around it. Now, last time I did this was anonymous, but you can actually adapt a little bit here, which is interesting. All right, this is a 15-second warning. I'm going to type into chat in, now 10 seconds from now, and anything below my my chat is not going to be eligible. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that goes to Brooks McLaughlin. Do you see anything tighter, Kathy? The answer is 4,600, and that is a sub 1,000 range inclusive of the answer there.
Yeah, I think it's also Brooks.
Awesome. Congratulations. Proud day for you and your family. We'll be in touch by email to send you the code there. So we're now off the script. We have about 9 more minutes of questions. So Kathy, if you just want to moderate and kind of bring forward whatever's been asked either before the session or during that you think is most appropriate, happy to do our best to answer those.
Yeah, let's start with Christian's question. They go, how do you know a feature is not worth experimenting after spending weeks of resources?
So when you say, so how do you know a feature is not experimenting with after spending weeks of resources?
It's not worth experimenting.
Yeah. So it's a bit like there's not going to be a one side. I'll address sort of what I think the intent behind the question is before addressing it. Like, this is the hardest thing to swallow about this whole, hey, it turns out that a third of tests aren't working. And that is, that you are spending a lot of expensive engineering time. And also, if you're doing it right culturally, you're getting kind of emotionally invested in a lot of the stuff that you build too. And so, some things do take a while to build, and it turns out that they don't work. I'm sure you're all familiar with sunk costs from economics. And essentially, the real answer here is like, unfortunately, it's bad. It's painful. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if it doesn't actually move things forward, you've made your code base more complicated. You've made it harder to onboard more people. Your menus have more options that are useless. So you're just like distracting the user from the most important journey. But the thing I would also say about that being hard is that because it's hard, on average, companies don't succeed at discarding that kind of work. They find rationalizations to include that in their product anyway. And the extent to which you can become a company that doesn't do that, you will beat them. You'll be more competitive. Your app will be better. When you need to make a change, you'll have less tech debt. And so I'll talk in a moment about some of the things you can do to test, what can we do to test before you've spent weeks of work on it? But, the real answer is that it's hard. Most people won't do it. And the extent to which you do it is a cultural moat that means your company will succeed and your equity worth something against your competitors. Now, in terms of, what can we do to test stuff without spending weeks on it? A lot of that really comes down to a hypothesis first approach. So instead of believing, hey, we really know what our customers need, starting with, this is the metric we're trying to move, and here's how we think we're going to do it. What are the things that we can do to examine whether this will have an impact or not? So there are some things like false door testing where, we'll expose this to 1% of users, a button that doesn't do anything or just tells them coming soon or something. If no one even clicks the button to start the flow in the first place, don't build the flow if you can't direct traffic in that direction. Or if there's going to be a machine learning algorithm that really personalizes something, is there some way we can approximate better personalization for 1/10 of the cost and just see, does that move the needle at all? Now, sometimes there are true architectural changes that are going to require a lot of work in order to test them out. And so in that case, you need to be okay with a potential loss and also thinking like, hey, if I need to invest at least a month of work up front from 2 skilled engineers to test this, I better really believe the payoff is worth it. Are there things that I can do that are lower effort to test that might have similar effects? So there's not a clean and easy answer. Everyone would be doing it. But again, the good news is that if you can do this, it's a competitive advantage. What's next, Kathy?
Yeah, Corey actually has a great question that he submitted earlier, which is, we often get stuck in the what should we test phase. What are some of the best ways to reduce idea to execution friction? I don't know if you can answer this in 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I think the one of the best ways to do kind of to figure out what to test is, we all had these exercises earlier, and all of us, myself included, were super wrong about a bunch of them. And we all had a reason in our brain why we thought that we'd be right. And those reasons aren't necessarily wrong. And so you might want to test those things. Like, it might be like, oh, I think seeing the crossed out price has a certain psychological effect if it's first, or I think the color matters. And so a lot of the reason to actually have, Airbnb actually runs meetings where they put the variance up and make people guess before they show the answer. And a big part of the reason they do that is because the rationale people have for why a variant wins or doesn't win can be a great thing to test next. So you kind of use that as a brainstorming of like, why did I think that? Great, that idea has not been tested yet. Let's try it out. If your problem is, hey, we've got 50 ideas and we don't know what to test, there's a variety of ways to address that. Probably the an easy way to go about that is, if you do have some sort of, polling system, getting back to my, earlier exposure to spending way too much time thinking about this stuff. If you give everyone like, 5 or 6 votes on a list of 50 and let them just kind of put a Post-it note in a room, or, vote online and kind of say, here are the 5 or 6 of these that I think are the most impactful, and just let those float to the top. You can get fancy or less fancy with that, but, a lot of, to the extent that everyone's really thinking about the idea and executing on that, if you just have a somewhat democratic process, that can often cause good stuff to bubble to the top, and also incentivizes people that are passionate about a particular idea to advocate it to other people. So, in this case, people sort of get in what they put out. And so it's okay that the advocacy is a little, unfair, so to speak, because it helps counterbalance senior leaders getting to choose everything and whatever their biases are manifesting in their product. I think we have time for one more big one or 2 small ones, Kathy.
Yeah, I think this
one wrap things up. If you have like a minute or 2 at the end, we should probably call it.
Yeah, I think this one is useful. I think, how do we ensure statistical robustness of our tests?
So I guess there's a couple different ways to look at that. Generally, using something like Growthbook is going to be quite robust compared to kind of DIY stuff, just because we are open source, and so people yell at us on the internet if we get things wrong, and we're using like a very common. I'm not speed drawing it fast enough. There we go. And we're drawing on like a very well trafficked Python stats library there. So in terms of like the mechanics of the test, I think we've probably got you handled there. To combat user error, some of the things you can do would be, there's a whole lot of like kind of foot guns in frequentist stats where like you're not allowed to look at it until a certain p-value, and it means nothing until it means everything. So if you have if you're like not strongly convicted of frequentist stats, using what's called Bayesian statistics, where you basically start off with huge ranges that say, hey, we're dumb and we don't know anything, and those ranges compress over time as you get more data. That can be really helpful because it's a little more intuitive to most folks. It's like saying we don't know, and then we're getting smarter and smarter, but at any point you can say like it's somewhere in this distribution, it's probably towards the middle. So a lot of the like statistical validity comes into play when you have frequentist stats and there's a p-value, and you're sort of like only allowed to look at certain times, and it's wholly invalid if it's not statistically significant. A lot of stuff's confusing. So if you don't have a good reason to use frequentist, use Bayesian, and that solves a lot of those problems, I guess. Not to say one's better than the other, but more like I think this is friendlier for newer people.